assessment cycle. We were thrilled to have such a high number of interest in today's webinar, and we're so glad that those of you could join us here on the line. Please continue to introduce yourselves in the chat box, and we'll take care of a couple of quick housekeeping items before we dive in. My name is Julia Smith, and I am Interfaith Youth Corps' Marketing and Communications Manager. And one of the best parts of my job is sitting here listening to folks like Karyn and JT as they share their wisdom about how we can make interfaith cooperation a social norm, which is what IFYC is here to do. So we're going to record this webinar, and barring any technical difficulties, that's our disclaimer, we will share the recording via an email to all of you within the next few days. So stay tuned. We'll definitely email out the slides, even if the recording doesn't work, and you're of course welcome to follow up with us. We'll share our contact info in a moment. You all, as you've noticed, are muted by default to cut down on background noise, but we'll try to make this as interactive as possible and pay attention to the chat box and share resources throughout, so please do avail yourself of that throughout. And at the end, I'll share a couple more resources and upcoming IFYC events. One of them, I'll repaste it in the chat box here, but we have a Facebook group for campus professionals advancing interfaith, and that link is going to appear in just a second in the chat box. And if you request to join, I will try to multitask here and approve your membership while we do this, if you're not already a member of that group. So please feel free throughout the hour, if you like to multitask, to tweet using @IFYC and #IFYC webinar, and or to start discussion threads in that Facebook group if you want to be sure to continue the conversation later. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague JT Snipes.
Thanks, Julia. We are so excited that you all are a part of this webinar. We have a lot of content to cover today, so we're just going to dive right in. And just to give you a little bit of information about who we are, my name is JT Snipes. I'm the Campus Assessments Manager here at IFYC. I am very excited to see some familiar faces, or at least voices, in the chat box. So my job is largely to work with assessment projects here at IFYC. We have a large multi-year longitudinal study called Ideals that's happening, and hopefully we'll send out a report pretty soon about that to you all if you haven't received it already. And if you're interested, I think we have it online, right? The Ideals Time 1 report?
I believe it is live, yeah.
Cool.
We can include that in the follow-up email.
Yeah, we can share that with you guys. So that's a little bit about me. Karyn, do you want to take a second and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, all. I wanted to say good afternoon, but I realized some of you may be in Mountain Time or West Coast time, so good morning to you all. I am a relatively new faculty member at Grand Valley State University in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I work with our master's students learning more about student affairs and working with undergraduate students. But I have a particular interest in increasing awareness and tools available to student affairs practitioners interested in using assessment to improve student learning. This is something that I did practically as a doctoral student at Indiana University, and I think it's a really exciting time for student affairs folks who are transitioning into doing a better job of looking at how well they're serving their students, and those who are interested in improving their practice. So I just have a vested interest in helping folks out with that, which is where I came in to kind of work with JT on this webinar.
Great.
So, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
We established a couple of different learning outcomes for this webinar, but I did want to say that this is kind of an awesome place to start, is to talk about learning outcomes. So after this presentation, our hope is that you as participants will be able to further differentiate between assessment, evaluation, and research, that you'll be able to identify 5 stages of the assessment cycle, which I think will enable, I often think assessment is sometimes cumbersome for folks to work through. This cycle kind of makes it easy or more user-friendly as far as I'm concerned. And the last is that we hope the information that's shared here will help you to initiate cycles of assessment on your own campus.
So you have heard what our outcomes are for today. We're interested in hearing from you. So Julia is going to pull up a quick poll and just let us know what brought you here today. What are you hoping to hear and learn from us? We'll give you a couple minutes. Also, folks, it doesn't have to be a dissertation or a thesis, so just a sentence or two. So since some of you all are having a little trouble with the poll function, feel free to use the chat box. Weird.
All right. I'm going to ask folks to go ahead and keep these great answers coming in the chat box. And if for some reason we don't address what you typed into the poll, please, again, feel free to let us know, because apparently that poll backfired a little bit. Thanks, Ellie, for verifying that that's not what it looks like on your end. Sorry about that, folks. So yeah, just use the chat box for the time being. I'm sorry to, yes, Ellie, so just to clarify, that was the back end and what it showed us, that we could see the percentage of people who were filling it out, which is why we went ahead and moved forward, because it looked like folks were jumping over the chat box anyway. So we will look through those answers afterwards if we're able to recover them and address them in our follow-up email also. But please do feel free to repeat yourselves if you don't mind in the chat, and we'll do our best to address your question.
Awesome. So for this quick reflection, we're just going to use the chat box as well. And to get the conversation started, this morning for some / afternoon for others, we want to talk a little bit about assessment. And for us, we know that oftentimes it can be a word that evokes a lot of emotions and feelings, and we just want to get your temperature in terms of how you all feel about assessment. So we'd like you to type 1 to 2 words that come to mind when you all think about assessment. And we'll give you a couple seconds to do that. We're putting you all to work this morning / afternoon.
I love Rose's response.
Challenging, headache. Quantitative, respected most. Oh, There's some good stuff from Rose coming back through with these comments.
Oh, Melanie.
Oh, Melanie.
Yes. These are all good words. Measures the impact of the budget line. Jargonish, yep. I'm feeling a lot of these. Well, thank you all for chiming in. Continue. This is awesome.
So, one of the first learning outcome that we established at the beginning of this session was related to differentiating between assessment, evaluation, and research. And I think when JT and I were putting this webinar together, we had probably a 45-minute long conversation about the differences between assessment, evaluation, and research, partly because we both think we're right about most of the things we know. And I think that this is, especially as your one words come in, I think that this is where sometimes the difficulty may start in best understanding how to know more about your students and how to improve programming at your institution when these three words are sometimes used interchangeably but actually mean different things. So we're just going to start by offering a little bit of a few definitions to kind of help put us all on the same page. So when we're talking about assessment, we are referring to a systematic collection of information about programs, departments, and institutions using the time, knowledge, expertise, and resources available for the purpose of improving learning and development. So one of the things that's particularly unique about assessment is that it is a little more focused on learning. Okay, so this is kind of the slower, more particular way to gather information, and it's often really focused on student learning, at least when we're referring to it in terms of student affairs or even learning in the classroom on college campuses. One thing that I think is a couple things that are really important about assessment and why they're highlighted in red. Assessment should be systematic and not haphazard. So I think when we're reading these words about time-consuming and challenging and headache, I think oftentimes there's a lot happening when we're thinking about what it means to assess something. And one of the ways that can kind of make things a little less confusing perhaps is to make sure that whatever data or evidence or stories are being collected from students, that it's done so in some sort of systematic way. Additionally, assessment should be building on resources that are already available. So I often told people when I was working with student affairs practitioners at Indiana University, most of you are already participating in assessment. It may just not be using those terms. So it's kind of, there's a need or necessity to thinking about, okay, what are we already doing that's collecting information about our programs or about student learning, which we can build upon or maybe further define to make this, to have a more systematic way of doing this. And the last thing here is that assessment should be done with improvement in mind. And when we're talking about assessment and not evaluation, we really are referring to student learning and development. So if we move to talk about, excuse me, sorry, I didn't know my phone would be ringing right now. Evaluation, if you can, thank you. We have this defined as, so two of the most well-known folks in student affairs assessment are Upcraft and Shue, and one of the ways that they define evaluation is any effort to use assessment evidence to improve institutional, departmental, divisional, or institutional effectiveness. So evaluation is often kind of more thought of as a moment in time rather than kind of an ongoing process with student learning in mind, and is often more associated with program evaluation or kind of larger scale goals like of an entire program rather than one component of an entire program, which may be some certain student learning outcome, for example. And lastly, when we talk about research, research is a systematic exploration of materials and sources in order to discover knowledge. So oftentimes research is thought of as something that is a little, it's value neutral. We are just trying to discover information, whereas evaluation and assessment are a little more direct. We're trying to see if this program is effective, or we're trying to see if the interventions that we are completing with students are actually leading to student learning. But research methods, certainly, or methodologies are used in the assessment and evaluation process. I think whether we use qualitative methods of gathering information or quantitative methods, or whether we're using both to kind of verify whether or not student learning is occurring or whether or not programs and services are effective. So I hope that helps a little bit. I do think that they're often used interchangeably, but we're hoping this helps you to kind of break down a little bit further what assessment does mean and what it doesn't mean, which might make it a little more manageable to get started.
And it's exciting. I know Karyn and I went back and forth for a while about the inclusion of research, but I think it's important to highlight that good assessment can often be good research, and those things aren't mutually exclusive. In particular, I'm thinking about the ideals study that I know a couple of you I've had conversations with about your data. So we have, for those of you who aren't familiar, I know Julia shared the link earlier. Ideals is a longitudinal study that includes over 122 campuses and over 20,000 students. So what I've been doing over the past few months is reaching out to campuses and talking them and having conversations with them about the data that has been collected on their campus, and what are the implications of that data, and how can it be used to improve the experiences of students on campus. So for me, I think it is very important, and I think Karyn did a fabulous job in outlining the differences between assessment, evaluation, and research. I just also want to give a plug to the amazing work that is happening both nationally and on campuses locally. So with that being said, it's quiz time. Hopefully this works better than the poll did earlier. So just take a couple seconds and complete the quiz. We'll give you all a couple minutes. We'll give you a couple more seconds.
Okay, great. So we'll go ahead and end the voting to keep it moving. I'll share these results. So of the folks who completed it, it looks like most people, almost 70%, got this first definition correct. This is how we define assessment. And then 50%, this is correct, right? JT, evaluation is the use of assessment data. Got that one correct. And then assessment is only useful when it is part of a larger research study. So 55% said false, and we would agree with those folks. So great job, everybody.
So the meat of our program today is around the assessment cycle itself, and what I would like to do, or what Karyn and I would like to do in the next few minutes, is give you an overview of what the assessment cycle is, and then open up the floor to the questions that you all are asking. And by no means do only Karyn and myself hold all of the knowledge. We also look to you all as professionals engaging in the work to share your stories and ideas and thoughts. We really take a collaborative approach to learning. So there are things that I know, and there are things that Karyn knows that we will share with you all today. But we're also interested in hearing from you and getting your perspectives on how this plays out in your work and in your world. So to start, I'm going to go through what the assessment cycle is. What you see on your screen is just that. This is the assessment cycle. It is not the only one. It is IFYC's version of the assessment cycle that has been adapted. If you Google assessment cycle, you will see literally hundreds of these charts. So for us, we adapted the work of Peggy Mackey and Megan Oakley's assessment cycle, and we have 5 stages that are outlined here. The first is defining goals, or defining learning outcomes and goals. The second stage is aligning learning outcomes, experiences, and assessment practices. The third stage is implementing assessment practices. The fourth is analyzing/making meaning of the data. And then the 5th stage is the use data to inform change and refine programming. So the assessment cycle ideally begins with stage 1 and ends with stage 5. But because the cycle is ongoing, it is possible to pick it up at any point. So for example, sometimes you've collected data and it hasn't been analyzed, so you can pick it up at stage 4 and begin analyzing the data, applying it, and then going back to your learning outcomes if you have them, and make changes. Or if you have learning outcomes already, you can begin with the alignment process. You don't have to start at the beginning, it cycles. So with that being said, we're going to walk through the assessment cycles stage by stage. So clearly, I love definitions. I know we've spent a lot of time defining things, but I think it's important to define what we think. It gets us on the same page. And again, at the outset, I want to acknowledge that people use different terminology to define both learning outcomes and goals. This, again, is how IFYC defines it. There will be other ways, either in your own institutions or in other resources that we share, but just know this is our perspective in both learning outcomes and goals. So you can see our definitions up here. Learning outcomes, there are 3 crucial parts to the learning outcome for us. First is that they are statements, so full sentences that have both the subject and a predicate. If you want to go back to English, so they're full sentences that express an idea or thought. The second thing, so they're statements. The second thing is that they express a desired result. So in the definition, you see the phrase individuals are expected to gain. So there's there's an anticipated end or outcome. And then finally, they involve action. So participating in the learning process. So they are statements that express a desired result and involve action. Goals or objectives are straightforward. We separate them from learning outcomes because they may not directly speak to the learning aspect, but may indirectly facilitate it. So as an example, you may have a goal or objective to retain 5 student leaders on your campus interfaith commission. So by students having that goal, you know that students being on your campus interfaith commission will learn some things, but it doesn't directly speak to that learning experience. Bless you.
Thank you.
So here are a couple examples of learning outcomes and goals. You can read them for yourself. We also like to take a minute to plug a really great resource that I did a webinar on a couple months ago that was actually creating interfaith learning outcomes. Julie is sharing the link in the chat box. I'd encourage you to check it out. It's a really great resource for those who haven't written learning outcomes before. It takes you step by step through the process. We use LD Fink's model taxonomy for different learning outcomes. So it's pretty straightforward, pretty easy to use, and very helpful. We also have a learning bank that you can access that has some learning outcomes that we share both in the resource that we created and some learning outcomes that were shared by different institutions. Also, because we are a community of scholars and learners and practitioners, we invite you to share your learning outcomes with us as well. If you have some really great interfaith learning outcomes, feel free to email me, and we'd be glad to share those with others. We really want the Learning Outcomes Bank to be a resource that is lively and used and beneficial to those who are doing the work. So that's stage 1. I'm going to pass it to Karyn to talk about stage 2.
So when we're talking about using our learning outcomes or when we think about learning outcomes in relation to the other 4 stages in the assessment cycle, one of the first steps is making sure that what our learning outcomes are in alignment with the experiences or the interventions or the services that we're providing to students. And I think this is when JT and I were talking about the assessment cycle and it being this ongoing process, the reality is that there are probably quite a few learning outcomes in your head about certain things that you're doing with your students, whether that's planned dialogue or town halls or some other type of programming or initiatives that you have going on your campus, that you may think in your head, this is what I know I want the students to get out of this, but you may not have made the direct link. So what I kind of want to reiterate here is that I am certain that folks are coming from all different points on that cycle. And one of them may be, we're already doing this program, and now we're trying to figure out how are we articulating what students are actually getting out of it. So it becomes critical to make sure that learning outcomes are aligned with practices. But I just want to be clear that may be longer down your road. Right now you may be trying to assess, okay, here's what we're actually doing. And maybe figuring out what our students are gaining from that, and are those the outcomes that we had in our minds? Are those the things that maybe we were hoping our students would achieve through the process, and then redefining them as you move forward throughout the cycle? So 2 important questions to ask as a part of this are how these experiences help meet your learning outcomes and goals. And remember, those 2 things are different. Learner outcomes are a little more detailed and student-specific, where goals may be broader or have multiple components. And then how do our current assessment practices provide evidence to support learning goals and outcomes? I can't tell you enough how important it is to take the time to just think about stuff. And this is going to sound super cheesy, but I think it might be really valuable for some people. Write down how you know things about your students, because I guarantee that practitioners all over the place know things about what their students are gaining from their services, but they're not necessarily written down or articulated in a way that is maybe user-friendly to an outside stakeholder or as a part of the accountability movements, either internal or external to your institution. So I like to encourage people to just take a step back and think about, what do I know about my students right now and how do I know it? Because I would be willing to bet a very small amount of money, because I am in the field of education, but a small amount of money on the fact that most of you are already are sitting on data, whether that's quantitative from, surveys or satisfaction surveys or post-event surveys, or whether it's just stuff that you anecdotally know. This is part of the process of figuring out, well, how can we align this better with student learning outcomes to kind of maximize what our students are gaining from what we're providing. Next.
So after you've done the work of aligning, you've made your learning outcomes, you've aligned it with the practices and programs that you have in place, then it becomes time to implement your actual assessment practice. And from the slide, you see that assessment is more than just surveys. I think that's important to press. Earlier, someone mentioned in the chat box that quantitative measures predominate the assessment world. So I want us to think more broadly about what assessment is and what encapsulates it. And what you have here is a list of different ways that you can collect information about your students and assess them, or your institution, or the practices that you have within your office as it relates. As far as the IFYC is concerned, with your interfaith work, for us, the goal is helping you all move toward greater assessment around these around the interfaith work that you have happening on your campus. So I've provided a list of different ways of assessing things. Reflection, which is very common. Hopefully, if you're teaching classes or if you're doing work, there's spaces for your students to reflect on their experience, either written or verbal. I think are powerful, and both formal and informal. One of my colleagues used to do an informal check-in with her students after events. She would ask them questions about, just 2 questions: what did they think of the event, and what did they learn from it? And writing down those thoughts, capturing what her students said, is a form of assessment and feedback. Again, for us, it's the systematic nature of it. So she was systematically doing it after programs and events, collecting this data about her students. And it didn't take a lot of time or a lot of effort, but it gave her some measure of what was happening in those spaces with the students she was working with. E-portfolios I put on there because they're really popular these days. They provide a form of assessment that the students themselves produce. So students will do websites, share writings. E-portfolios are really big business these days and are really helpful in providing multiple points of data about the students and their learning that's happening on campus. And then there are several other forms of assessment on the page that I won't go through. But the message is there are more ways to assess your students than just surveys. So feel free to think about the multitude of ways in which you can get information about your students. So if you want to. So one of the things that I want to caution you all on, I know after our wonderful presentation today, you guys will want to assess everything. And for me, I think I'm like the snake in this picture, particularly when I get hungry. I want to eat everything, and I don't think things through, and later I regret it. So for us, we want you to take smaller, more manageable bites. Don't follow the example of this snake and try to assess all of your learning outcomes at once, both divisional and institutional. What we encourage you to do is to take on something much more manageable. And if you do have the resources to do more, then obviously we want you to do more, but we don't want you to be overwhelmed by the process and biting off more than you can chew, because assessment does take some time. So you want to be thoughtful at the outset of a couple of things. So some of the things we want you to consider is time. So if you go back to our definition of assessment, we talk about the time and resources that you have available. So think about the time that you can devote to doing assessment. And if you embed assessment in the work that you're doing, if you're thinking about it at the outset for your programs and events that you're hosting, and you can actually embed it, and it doesn't have to be tacked on. It can be a part of the program, and you can get really great data. So think about the time that you have available to devote to the project. Also think about the resources that you have available. I've already discussed time as a resource, but also think about institutional support. Do you have student workers or other professionals that may be interested in answering some of the same questions that you have, or collecting information about students that could benefit multiple parties, and what are the ways in which you can work together on doing some assessment? And then also think about financial resources. Do you have money to purchase assessments or to work with other people? Does your institution offer grants around assessment? Or are there some organizations that provide money to do assessment? And then finally, and most importantly, the thing that you want to consider is what's the knowledge and expertise that you already have? I think sometimes people think about assessment as something being external to them, but as Karyn already mentioned, you all are already engaging in assessment, and you know your students, and you know information about your students. So what are the talents, strengths, and skills that you have that you can leverage in doing assessment?
So the fourth stage of that cycle is related to analyzing and making meaning of the data or evidence that you're collecting. So I want to just talk about three important things, and I'm going to try to do so somewhat briefly, but the first of which is spending time to reflect on it. Second of which is triangulating findings with other data or evidence and bringing in other stakeholders. They all fit together, but I'll start with spending time to reflect. When I was thinking about what to reference here, when I was thinking about this time, depending on what kind of data you're collecting, if you maybe have completed a focus group, or if you are collecting quick bites of information after a program or something, I encourage folks to look at it and then put it away, take some time to think about it and come back to it later, just to allow yourself to really kind of digest the information that you're getting in. I was thinking about my first semester of student evaluations here. I read them when I received them. There was one evaluation that just hit me right in the heart, and I was super disjointed about that evaluation. But when I came back, I realized, oh no, here's the constructive stuff I can take out of this, and allowed myself to kind of be in a space where all feedback was good feedback. And I think that's a really important part of this process, whether you're getting feedback that's positive or negative, or that is perceived as positive or negative. It's important to be able to take the time to look and see what's constructive about either that positive or negative feedback, right? I often also say that I'd rather receive feedback that's a little less pleasant than just a word that says good, because I don't really know what good means either. So I would suggest taking some time to reflect on that. Secondly, and kind of related, is triangulating findings with other data. I think oftentimes there's a ton of data at all institutions, right? And I recognize a couple of the names that people are familiar with, or there may be some people out there familiar with NESI. the National Survey of Student Engagement. And one of the things, which is a program that I worked with when I was in school, one of the things that I always stress is that it's really important not to just take data at face value, but to see how it may interact with other information that you know about your students or other information that you know from other programs on campus, for instance. So this kind of offers the opportunity to begin or to continue collaboration between yourselves and other areas on campus, or perhaps even within academic disciplines. There are a lot of ways that I think that you can kind of use the information that you're learning about to see how that may relate with other information that's available on campus, which kind of fits in with the bringing in other stakeholders as well. One of the things that makes higher education so fascinating and so sometimes infuriating is the amount of people that are involved in its success. But that's not always a bad thing. It's important to allow for other folks to review data and to help kind of analyze data and reflect on it, because different eyes see different things. And I think it's really one of those important components of really getting the most out of the information that you're gathering in the process.
So sorry, we were muted.
I was talking to myself, something that is not new. The final stage is using data to inform change and to refine programming. And in this stage, it's often referred to as closing the loop. So oftentimes, for those who have been engaged in assessment work, people will do a lot of work to collect data, to analyze it, create very stunning reports, and then those reports just end up sitting on a bookshelf somewhere. So what we want to encourage folks to do, and what you should do, make some decisions based on the data that you've collected. And sometimes a decision is to not change anything. You have data that confirms the work you're doing is helpful and the ways in which you're doing it is helpful. At that point, the assessment data can be sort of a bragging point or reaffirming point for you to get the things that you need. So this final step is closing the loop. And if we think about the cycle as a circle, the assessment cycle is left open if you don't apply that data to inform the change. So to help guide the process, here's some questions that we encourage you to think about. The first question is, what worked? So based on the information you collected and analyzed, designed your assessment well, you should have some actionable information about your program or area. So at the outset, at the beginning, as you are aligning your goals, at this is where we go back to stage 2 being crucial. So aligning your outcomes with your programs and your assessment tools. So if you've done that work early, you should have some clear direction about where to go next. Another question that I think is important to ask is what needs to change. Sometimes major changes aren't necessary, and your assessment, again, is a pat on the back to the work that you're already doing. But even in those cases where the assessment largely affirms what you're doing, it can lead you to different areas of assessing or different questions or different ways of thinking about the work that you're doing. The assessment process in and of itself is a learning process. So even by the fact of asking questions, if the data doesn't show any differences or major changes, just participating in the process of assessment is beneficial to get you to be reflective about the work you're doing. And then finally, one of the things that is often forgot in the process of assessment you evaluate your learning outcomes and goals, but oftentimes we forget to evaluate the instruments and methods that we use to assess your work. So in closing the loop, it's important to do that very thing. So we have one final quiz that will be pretty quick, and then after that we'll open up the floor to you all and the questions that you have for us.
We'll give you about 15 or 20 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to end the voting just to keep us moving forward here.
So we're not going to spend a lot of time on it. Most of you got it, the first one right. Create an institutional survey is not a part of the assessment cycle. For this second question, I realize that it is poorly worded, so we won't pay attention to the results. The idea behind that question is that we really want you to know that you can start the assessment cycle at any space. I think some of you might be thinking about having the cycle doesn't really make sense without having learning outcomes to evaluate. So sorry for the confusion. With that being said, I will open up the floor to questions that you all have about our presentation, or some of the questions that you all had earlier around just the presentation in general.
And this is Julia. James, just want to acknowledge your question and say that I'm hoping that the 2 links I pasted in the chat box after your question will be helpful to you. But if you want to elaborate or ask further questions, certainly feel free. So we're getting a question from Parker about tips for encouraging participation in assessments or ways to encourage wider participation.
So we've been in the throes of conducting or working with campuses as they administer the IDEAL survey. Incentives are a way to encourage participation. You want to be careful about using incentives that the incentive isn't so great that it drives a particular population or a group of students to participate. And also, incentives in general, there's a debate about that, and I don't know, Karyn, if you want to chime in. But incentives can be helpful. Also, just partnering and being where students are. and again, embedding assessment into the events that you're doing. So one of the things that we like to do is include reflections in the programs that we offer. So I'll just be quiet and let Karyn share.
Well, one of the things I wanted to say in regard to student participation in assessment and encouraging wider participation, Parker, if that's what you're talking about. I think one of the things that Nessie sees anyway, which is a giant survey, so that's not necessarily a focus group or something where an incentive might be directly helpful, like what undergraduate student doesn't love pizza, I don't know. But I think that probably the schools that appeared to have the most effective or the highest response rates, and I put that in quotes because I don't want this to be quantitative heavy, but the reality is students want to know that the information they're sharing is being heard and valued and that acted upon. So I think that as you move forward in your practice, even if it's on a small level, if you hold a focus group after some sort of an event, I think it's really important to share with students what you heard and what is going to happen next because of the information that you gained. I think it makes students feel validated in whatever process they just participated in. And then I was going to speak a little bit to Melanie's question about survey fatigue, which is very real, and I think this is an important question to ask. The first thing I would say is to remember that not all assessment needs to be a survey. So that's one way to start thinking a little more creatively or innovatively about other ways that you can gather information from your students. And I can share at least an example of, Melanie, I'm not sure what kind of institution you are, if you're at a big institution or a small institution, or kind of what assessment looks like or institutional research looks like on the whole. However, I can say that there are institutions that are now trying to centralize survey administration so that students aren't over-surveyed. So that this may work a little bit better at larger institutions, but basically what happens is instead of being focused on, we want to make sure that we're asking the most number of students possible about this issue, right? We're going to ask enough people. So we're going to ask a smaller group of students, and we're going to use that data and triangulate it with maybe other information that's collected in other ways, so that not all students are being surveyed for all. I'm having a rough time with words right now, folks. But that not all students are contacted for all of the initiatives that are going on campus, if that makes sense. So I know their surveys on campus are actually sent and kind of managed from one central location, and just small, like, representative samples are drawn from, as opposed to everyone receiving every survey, which I think sometimes helps.
Great. Or maybe one or two more questions?
So let's start with recommend using qualitative data in a way that's meaningful.
I'm very excited that you asked this question because qualitative data is able to give narrative or shape or story to what we're seeing. So when you do collect qualitative data, obviously we live in an environment, and I will say this is my opinion, and it is up for debate, but I think too often when we think about sources of assessment data that are reliable and valid, institutions turn to quantitative data. I sense there's a slight shift in the environment But qualitative data is powerful in the sense that it helps give understanding happening. And I know IFYC, when my own organization, we're very embedded in the idea of storytelling because we think if you're able to leverage these stories and share these stories, it has what I call the characteristics of catalytic validity. So you get data through your qualitative data using the voice of your students that inspires people and moves them to action. I know that's a part of our methodology here at IFYC, is that we're systematic about collecting student stories and sharing them and moving them to a space and helping move people to a space of action. And I know for a fact there are lots of different spaces within the Academy that are interested in hearing student stories. Particularly one of the departments that comes to mind is advancement. Institutions are trying to collect money and they are always interested in hearing student stories. And qualitative data can give you, fill in the gaps that you don't know through the quantitative surveys that you're administering. So it gives a different viewpoint, and I think people are reticent to engage in qualitative methods just because of the time that it takes to analyze the data. Survey analysis is pretty straightforward. If the survey is simple, I mean, it can get complicated, obviously, but I think people are much more comfortable with just reading the numbers, and I think with analyzing the qualitative data, you have to spend a little more time.
Karyn, thank you for chiming in via the chat box to address Melanie's question. I'm going to move us to our closing slides here, but maybe if we think of additional specific creative examples for embedding assessment into programs, we can try to link some of those or include stories in the follow-up email that we'll send out to folks.
And we are we're creating some new resources, particularly around qualitative methods. So we're working on a resource right now to conduct focus groups, and there'll be some other resources coming out this year to really help folks assess qualitatively the work that they're doing.
Cool. So JT just mentioned we're always developing more resources, and if you're on our mailing list, you should get emails when those come out. We also have a really big lineup of these online sessions coming up this year, so we hope that you will make sure you're subscribed to our emails. The webinars page is ifyc.org/webinars, and I didn't include the link here because we just haven't added this whole new slate. We're just finalizing a few more that are going to go up on the academic year calendar, but we're excited to have a lot in store for you. So if there are specific topics you hope we'll cover in a resource or webinar, don't hesitate to email me. I'm julia@ifyc.org. We also have a team of folks here at IFYC who are point people for campuses. So if you're not sure whether there is one of those for your campus or you'd like to have one of those to kind of troubleshoot issues as they arise throughout the year, but also to be networked with other people who are at campuses that might be a similar profile to yours and talk about assessment and lots of other interfaith-related topics, I'm happy to help facilitate that. And then I mentioned the Facebook group. If you didn't join, please feel free to send a request and I'll approve you as fast as possible today. And thank you. I can see Becky, I can see folks even joining because they're so excited about this topic at the very end of the hour. So stay tuned for the email that will come in the next couple of days from me. And be sure to let Karyn or JT know if you have specific questions for them or want to be in touch. I just want to thank you both so much for sharing your expertise today, and thank you to everyone who was on the chat and so active there. Thank you all so much.
Bye.
Thanks again. Take care, everyone.